Welcome to everyone this morning. Appreciate you being here. Today, we're going to conclude the series of studies that we began last summer, a monthly study about following the signs. We've used this theme to go through the Gospel of John. John's Gospel is intended to show us signs pointing to the new creation that God was bringing about through Jesus. We noticed the 6 signs of the first 12 chapters, all which are pointing to the 2 signs of the last half of the book. That, of course, being the cross of Jesus and then His resurrection. Last month we discussed the crucifixion of Jesus and what was accomplished at Calvary and why it is so significant and how it was so surprising and unanticipated. Equally unanticipated with His death, of course, was His resurrection from the dead. And that's what we're going to conclude our study with this morning. If you'd open your Bible to John chapter 20, we're going to spend the balance of our time in John 20, where John writes about the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. The resurrection of Jesus is quite a surprising event, and it continues to be a surprising event. It is the very foundation of the faith that so many have practiced down through the years. And as Paul would write in some of his letters, without the resurrection of Christ from the dead, our faith is worthless. So to the believer, the resurrection is everything. This lesson this morning is intended to strengthen our faith in the resurrection. But not only is it intended to strengthen our faith in it, it is designed to help produce faith in those perhaps who are skeptical of it, who are critical of it. The resurrection of Jesus is quite an incredible claim. And for that reason, some are just stuck there. They cannot believe that a dead man rose to new life. A dead man raising to new life defies everything we know about life and death. As far as we know and understand and experience, death is the greatest of all human separations known. It's why it brings us such pain and distress. We know that when a person dies, we're not going to see them any longer. We're not going to hear their voice anymore. It's the end. But ladies and gentlemen, the resurrection of Jesus changes all of that. Changes all of that and more. So as we begin our study this morning, I want to start by stressing to you that the resurrection of Jesus is rational. And what I want to do is to notice with you a couple things that are expressed in John chapter 20 at the outset that will help solidify faith, help even instill and grow faith in the claim that He's risen. Here in the first 2 verses of the text, it says, "Now on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early while it was still dark, and saw the stone had been taken away from the tomb. So she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them, 'They've taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they've laid Him.'" There's some important things that are happening here in John chapter 20 that perhaps are not fully appreciated. But I want to pull from the text to try to show you that what is being described is rational. What John is doing is he's giving his readers, you and I, he's giving us evidence. I said that's so much of what John does in his writing generally. He's giving us signs that represent evidence pointing ultimately toward Jesus. What's some of the evidence here of John chapter 20? Well, it's quite significant. It's quite significant that the first one to know that something drastic has taken place is a woman. You know, the first evidence, the first witnesses of the resurrection in the Scriptures are women. That's critically valuable in terms of evidence. Well, why would I say something like that? Well, in this culture, in this society, not ours, in the first century, what we're talking about here, the historical time period, of course, women have no legal rights. They're not recognized as credible. Now, of course, the biggest argument against the resurrection is that it just didn't happen. It didn't happen. And there are a number of theories that have been put out since the claims were first made that continue to be made to this day. If you were going to make up a story, if it was your goal, you say that the disciples made this story up. They invented the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. They're grief-stricken. They don't want to be made a fool. So they make this story up to try to keep Jesus alive and try to save face, save credibility. And they make a story up that he'd been risen from the grave, risen from the dead. Well, if you were going to do that, if you were going to try to create a compelling story, you never would have begun the story by saying, 6 women were the first witnesses. You just wouldn't have done that because no one would have believed you. You wouldn't have said women were the first to witness the resurrection unless it was true. Now, when John is writing this, and you can look at the resurrection accounts in the other Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all 4 of those Gospels are written later in terms of when other books of the New Testament were written, 30, 40 years, 50 years after the events. But yet women here are brought to the forefront. Celeste, he's a 2nd century writer, critic of Christianity. Maybe he was a critter, I don't know, but a critic of Christianity. When he wrote about one of his criticisms, and there's other people who've written over time about the evidence, the eyewitnesses of women. In the 2nd century, Celeste, he said that Mary Magdalene, she's quite an interesting figure in the New Testament. Jesus cast 7 demons out of her. And as far as Celeste was concerned about the witness of Mary Magdalene, he describes her as a hysterical female deluded by sorcery. My point is if you were going to make up a story to try to compel people to believe you, you wouldn't have said women, much less a woman like Mary Magdalene. Yet, John begins with her. Women as witnesses only strengthened and solidified the veracity of the claim that Jesus was risen. Now, there's other places that describe some of the eyewitnesses. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, we could have spent, I chose not to, but we could have spent our entire time this morning looking at 1 Corinthians chapter 15. We'll do that at a later date, I'm sure. Because 1 Corinthians 15 is the earliest document that we have written about the resurrection of Jesus. And what is written, what is cited in the opening verses of chapter 15 is evidence that Paul cites as evidence of the resurrection of Jesus. And he talks about some witnesses. Witnesses. It wasn't just 7 women who witnessed the resurrected Lord. It wasn't just the apostles who witnessed the resurrected Lord. If it was, then maybe there's some strength in the claims that this was just all invented by some grief-stricken followers of Jesus trying to save credibility and keep his story alive. Trouble is, there were more eyewitnesses than just that. Paul writes that the resurrected Lord showed himself to 500 men at once. And if you look into the language that's used there, 500 men, sometimes when the Scriptures gives a count, like when Jesus fed the 5,000 men, besides women and children. And you say, describing that miracle, if 5,000 wasn't great enough, you say, well, it was even more than that. because the count doesn't include women and children. And some scholars will look to this text here in 1 Corinthians 15 and say the 500 men, the 500 brothers at once, it might have been more than 500 who witnessed. It's just that the men were included. The point that Paul makes as he writes about the resurrection in 1 Corinthians 15 is that there's evidence, there's witnesses who were still living at the time of that writing. I mean, and if you were so inclined, I mean, you could go and find some of the witnesses. But that's not the only example of the resurrection being explained in Scriptures as rational. If we go on into verses 6 and 7, Simon Peter came following the disciple that the Lord loved, went into the tomb. Mary's gone back and said, we think that somebody's taken the body of the Lord. So Simon, he comes back. When he goes into the tomb, it says he saw the linen clothes lying there, and the face cloth which had been on Jesus' head, not lying with the linen clothes, but folded up in a place by himself. By itself. Now this is significant because the text is trying to tell us what's going on with Peter. What is he thinking? Certainly he is grief-stricken, undoubtedly. Mary Magdalene comes and says, they've taken the Lord out of the tomb. We don't know where they've laid him. His body's been stolen. His body's been stolen is the claim. So he goes back and he goes in and it says he saw. He saw. That word is interesting. When you look at that and you think, well, yeah, he just looked into the tomb. Well, yes, he looked into the tomb, but the writer here is telling us what's going on in his mind. The idea that he saw, that word, what it means is that he is intently discerning. He is intently discerning. He's trying to make sense of the scene and the claim that Mary has made that someone has stolen his body. So he goes into the tomb. Does it look like someone has stolen his body? Does it look like grave robbers have come into the tomb and stolen the body of Jesus? John says the linen clothes are left behind and they're folded. That doesn't look like a crime scene. I mean, if somebody's stealing a body in the dark of night, doesn't want to be noticed, and by the way, there were soldiers there guarding the tomb in the first place because they were worried that someone was going to come and a disciple was going to come and steal his body. But even if that happened, surely the grave robbers wouldn't have folded the clothes. But there's even more than that. What else is in the grave? Well, we're told that Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, they went to Pilate to claim the body of Jesus after he died. After he died. There's no question Jesus was dead. Remember last month we talked about how his death was confirmed when the Roman soldiers speared the side of Jesus. Blood and water came out. And we said that indicated that he had already died before he was stabbed. There's a medical explanation there. If he hadn't been dead before he was stabbed, he was after. But the point, because of the blood and water, he was dead before he had been stabbed. But Joseph of Arimathea comes, and Nicodemus. Now these are wealthy men, both of them. Joseph of Arimathea are wealthy men. And they don't just throw Jesus in a tomb. They place him in a tomb, but Joseph comes with 100 pounds of spices and oils. We're told he comes with 100 pounds. That's significant because that's not what you would have used to bury the son of a carpenter. When the average person in Israel died and they placed them in the tombs, they would place them in the tomb and they would leave them in the tomb for about a year or so, and they'd come back to the tomb, and after the the flesh had decomposed, they would take the bones out of the tomb and they would place the bones in a little box, an ossuary. But they would bring oils and spices to cover the scent. But they didn't come with 100 pounds. I mean, the value of that? There's only really one kind of person who was buried with 100 pounds of spices and ointment. I mean, that's what you'd bring to bury a king. That act alone speaks volumes about what Joseph and Nicodemus thought of Jesus. My point, you have 100 pounds of spices and ointment, valuable commodities, and they've not been taken. I tell you, ladies and gentlemen, the claims of the resurrection are rational. Just look at what the text says. Notice the features. Notice what's present. Does it make sense? Does it make sense? Use some logic. Does it make sense that his body was stolen? Peter's intently discerning the scene. Secondly, the resurrection of Jesus is comforting. It's comforting. And you see this especially in the tender way that Jesus will interact with Mary. In verse 11 it says, "But Mary stood weeping outside the tomb. And as she wept, she stooped and looked into the tomb. And she saw two angels in white sitting where the body of Jesus had lain, one on the head and one at the feet. They said to her, 'Woman, why are you weeping?' She said to them, 'They've taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they've laid him.'" Mary's grief-stricken, compounding her grief is this thought that she has that somebody has just, of all things, has stolen his body. And we talk about desecrating a corpse. We can only begin to imagine how that compounds her grief. It goes on here to say, "But having said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing. But she did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, 'Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking?' Supposing him to be the gardener, she said to him, 'Sir, if you've carried him away, tell me where you've laid him, and I will take him away.'" So there's the resurrected Lord standing behind her. And he speaks. She thinks the gardener's there. It's interesting to kind of go more broadly to the Gospel of John. You know, John is writing about signs of new creation. The old creation began and culminated in a garden. Here again, the new creation is taking place in a garden. She thinks Jesus is the gardener, and she interrupts, "Why are you weeping? Who are you seeking?" Those are profound questions with incredible personal meaning. Jesus is looking for those who are weeping. He's looking for those who are seeking. If you weep, if you seek, he'll come to you. And that's what he does here. But as they begin to talk, she doesn't know who she's talking to. She only thinks that they've taken him away and they don't know where he's been laid. Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned and said to him in Aramaic, "Rabboni." I want you to appreciate this conversation this morning. I want you to try as best you can to imagine what this moment in time must have been like for Mary absolutely grief-stricken, distressed, defeated, crushed. And with one word, it all changes. When the man supposed to be the gardener said her name, her life was forever changed. Jesus knew who she was. Not just Jesus, but the resurrected Lord knew who she was and called her by name. And she responds with the word Rabboni. It's interesting how John will do this sometimes in key moments. You don't give the translation. You leave the original words spoken right on the paper. He'll tell you what they meant, but those words are far too important, far too sacred. Know what was originally said. Know what it sounded like. Ladies and gentlemen, weeping and seeking Jesus, what we want is for Him to know who we are, to be known of Him. He knows it. He knows us by name. It is this great longing to be known by the resurrected Lord that becomes our hope, that becomes our comfort as it is here. The very thought of not being known is haunting. Jesus was known to warn about people that thought they were known who weren't. And we treasure the blessing of being known by the Lord. And what happens here, beginning with Mary, as she's known, as she is forever changed, she's transformed. The resurrection is transforming. And you see that with Jesus Himself. Later on, as Jesus will show Himself to the disciples, they're confused and perplexed by it. They say they recognize Him, they know who He is, but He's different at the same time. He's the same but different. Something is changed. What's happening with Jesus is a sign of what He wants to have happen with us. Here we find that this transformation unfolding. Mary Magdalene in verse 20 went and announced to the disciples, "I have seen the Lord," and that He had said these things to her. Oh no. Mary goes to the tomb at the beginning of the chapter looking for a dead man. She leaves the tomb having seen a man with new life. And she goes back and she doesn't say, "Oh, somebody's stolen his body." She goes back and recounts that He's risen. She's not embarrassed. She's not shy. She's not afraid of what will they think of me. That's how the truth works, ladies and gentlemen. When you know the truth, you will speak the truth regardless of what someone else thinks of you, because it's the truth. And if somebody thinks you're crazy, it doesn't change the truth. She goes back in faith. She goes back with courage. She goes back with boldness to tell them the gospel. Later on in verses 21 to 23, we continue to see this transformation unfolding with the disciples. They have an encounter with the risen Lord. Jesus says to them, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, even so I am sent to you." And when He had said this, He breathed on them and said to them, "Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive the sins of any, they are forgiven them. If you withhold forgiveness from any, it is withheld." a couple of points about what John has been showing us. In the introduction in chapter 1, John tells us that he is going to show us how Jesus brings new creation through his sacrificial death upon the cross and by giving the Spirit to believers. And here it is beginning to all come together. In the old creation in Genesis, how is it that life was given? God formed man from the dust of the ground, and he breathed life into the dust, and it came forth. Well, here it is all happening again, but in a different way. Jesus breathes the Spirit upon the believers. Ladies and gentlemen, the Spirit brings life. That is the clarifying trait of the Spirit. The Spirit brings life. New life. New life that ultimately would sustain and guide these men and other believers to make these bold claims that He's risen. But lastly, as we think about this incredible scene in John chapter 20 and the interactions that the disciples have with the risen Lord, it is quite amazing. And I suppose there's much more that we could look at and probe in what's going on here. But at the close of the chapter, it is made very clear that the resurrection of Jesus is for us to have life. The resurrection of Jesus is for us to have life. John is not just recording a history. It's more than that. John, as he closes the chapter, he says, "Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written, so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in His name." John writes about the scene of the risen Lord so that we would believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. And that we would believe so that we might gain life. So that we might share in what the original disciples had. He is the life. He is our only hope. And the hope that Christianity offers, ladies and gentlemen, is not wishful thinking. The hope of Christianity is based upon fact. And that is what is documented in the Scriptures. Here's the facts of what happened. Here are events that changed the world in an unexpected, surprising way. And these events continue to have profound meaning in the world today, to have profound meaning in our lives today. If you and I want life, hope, if we want forgiveness of our sins, then we must believe that He's risen and allow that belief to transform our lives in the hope of being united with Him one day in His Father's house. Follow the signs. Read them carefully. Take steps of faith toward all of the goodness and grace that Jesus hopes to give us. I appreciate your attention this morning. I hope today's lesson has been helpful for you. I hope it has been one that will strengthen your faith. Perhaps for some, I hope it serves as the means by which your faith can be born. If there's someone here today who has faith enough to follow, faith enough to obey, then you can be baptized into Christ, to share in His death and resurrection, to be raised to new life, to become a symbol, to become a sign yourself of what the gospel can accomplish if we would but believe. If we can help you obey today, please come forward and make your request known right now as we stand and sing.